Howdy folks, it's a rainy day today, and Ichabod had a really good idea that we would do a video on the sidecar. And I had a recent request from a viewer in a comment on doing exactly that. Apparently the viewer is interested in perhaps making or getting a sidecar, and so that's why I wanted to do this. Plus I've been thinking about it for a while. Now this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go over this in a chronological fashion, utilizing voiceover inside on the computer with a bunch of still photos. It's really the only practical way to do it, because I did take a lot of still photography when I built this thing. Didn't do any videos that I can remember, but if I find them and they're appropriate, I will stick them in as clips. So anyway, we're going to start with the bike, and then we'll go to the sidecar frame, and then we'll go to the sidecar body. Maybe talk about some ancillary add-ons like the rooster fairing. That's the second rooster fairing, actually. The first one was the earlier generation of it, that it was a different plastic and was kind of falling apart. This one is much better quality, but still vintage and period correct. What I'm not going to do is I'm not going to talk about the operation and the differences or the nuances of 3 wheels versus 2 in this video. It's just too long. We'll have to do that separately. Nor am I going to go into detail in this video on the leading link front end that I built. It's a custom, homemade, shop-made, if you will. Not going to cover it in this one. We'll have to do that separately. It's just too much. There's a lot of engineering and so forth that I'd want to talk about in the leading link section. So we're going to have to break that onto a separate video. So with that, let's get right to it.
The Magna started in this form. You see it right here. This is a picture that was provided to me by a friend of mine who was selling it. It was actually his girlfriend's late father's bike. And we had to work through some title issues with the surviving spouse, but we got that done. And I purchased it from him, I'd say about, 6, 7, 8 years ago or so. And this is what it looked like when I got it. It ran, but it was pissing fuel out the carbs, and it had a whole bunch of other problems. So I initially bought this just as a bike to ride around, and I was going to kind of change it into more of a cafe style than a cruiser style. And that's what I originally did, which we'll see in some other pictures coming up. But then ultimately it morphed into the sidecar, which is a whole nother story in itself. I had the little lift back then. It's actually a lift I don't even have anymore. And of course I put the Magna up and started to work on it. So naturally, I did my normal magic on it and spent, I'd say, a better part of a month or so between getting parts, putting it back together, getting it running, learning about it. You know, there's a learning curve on a V4. I'd never really worked on one extensively. And then once we got it to that point, I got the carbs all rebuilt and everything running right. I put it into its color form that you see right now, where I did some painting and body work. Here's the gas tank. After I finished it, it was sitting there drying with a clear coat curing. The Honda stickers I obtained from Diablo Cycle back then, and they are under the clear coat. And they're the period or the style correct stickers for the Magna. So what I ended up doing was I shot this with actually acrylic lacquer paint, Duplicolor. I was on a budget back then. And the color is, I forgot the color description, but it's Toyota 3R3, some sort of a burgundy red something or other paint that I liked. And there's a whole big long story as to why I've been using that paint for so long. It has to do with the old KZ1100. It's really too long to go into here, but I just essentially, in a summary that is, I used that paint to color match a super red part on an old KZ1100 that I had, and it matched perfectly with the metallic and everything. So I just took that, and since I liked it, and just extrapolated that over to the Magna and decided to paint it that same color red. Shot of a side cover. That'll be the left side cover. You can see a little bit of the right one above it. These are the same color, of course, and I got the decals again from Diablo. They are under the clear coat. I did make a mistake on these, although I shot them the same color paint. That came out real well. The tank, I coated with the 2K, the 2-part urethane, the hardener clear coat. I don't recall if it was from the can or if I actually shot that with a gun. I think I did it with a gun. Anyway, I ran out of clear when I did these, and I just used a acrylic lacquer clear. Now that came back to bite me years later because that shit just really started to look like crap. So since then, what I've done is I was doing some 2K in a can one day, and I took and wet sanded these down and shot them with 2K and brightened them right up. So they pretty much almost look like this now. Not quite as good. This was a while back, but so that's what I did with the side covers. Here's an earlier shot of when I was putting it back together with the painted parts. Now you can see that tank is dull. It has not been clear coated yet. And I honestly don't remember why I put it up on here to do that. I must have been fitting it or checking something. I don't know. I certainly was not running fuel in it. So maybe I was setting up the hoses. I don't know. But so that's, I'm getting closer, of course, in this picture. And we'll show you here momentarily what the original configuration looked like when it was on two wheels. And here is what that looks like. Now you notice the handlebars are much lower, and that's because I dumped the original sway back or pull back bars, the cruiser type bars. The bars that I still have it on it to this day are actually Clubman style, turned upside down. I got that idea from a forum, which brings them not too far forward, but lower, and that's what I was looking for. So it kind of got that sportier look. I also jacked the forks up into the triple tree a little bit further to lower that front end and make it less like a cruiser, and it worked fine. Now, it didn't work so fine after I got the sidecar hooked up to it, but that's a whole nother topic later on here. So that's essentially it's exactly what it looks like after I got the initial bike done. Unfortunately, I don't have any more that I can find of the bike in this condition because it didn't stay in this condition long. And that kind of brings us into the whole reason that I went to third wheel, the sidecar route. Yep, it's all about the dog, folks, as it always is. What spurred me into this direction, and inspired me would be a better word, was a video documentary called Sit, Stay, Ride, The Story of America's Sidecar Dogs. And I bought the DVD. It was it is a very well-produced video. It's exceptionally well done, very professional. And so I really enjoyed it very much, watched it several times, reached out to some of the people that were highlighted in it on social media, asked them some questions, and then I finally pulled the trigger when the boss gave me the okay to start dumping some serious money into this because, as we'll discuss here in a minute, that tub was not cheap. So that's how it all got started, thinking about my buddy. I think I need to preface this real quick by saying that if you're new to sidecarring and you want to get into it, unless you have some tools, some time, and some skills in fabrication, and preferably some machine tools, I'd recommend either A, having someone build a package for you based on whatever motorcycle that's suitable, or B, buy yourself a sidecar outfit that's already together. Because it's very difficult to do, and even with my skill set that I have is very challenging. Because not only do you have to learn about, if you're not totally skilled in all those things, I mean, you're going to have to learn to do them, and you're going to have to figure out and learn all about the geometry of setting up a sidecar. And all of that is actually pretty difficult to do until you get your head wrapped around it. It's not impossible, but I would say the easy route is to buy a package, again, that's already done or have somebody build one. I'll put some links in the description to a couple places that I know are excellent sidecar builders, and I may miss some, but I'm just going to put the ones I know in there at least. But if you really think about it, you need three things for a sidecar. I think we'll use this cute picture to demonstrate or illustrate my point. Obviously, one of the first three things you need is your motorcycle, which is also called the tug. Sometimes a bike is called the tug. Next, of course, you need the frame. which is for the sidecar, which also includes the mounting bracketry, the mounting hardware to articulate it to the tug or the motorcycle. The third part is the chair or the tub, whatever you want to call it, where people sit or animals sit or whatever you're going to haul in there is going to go. Now, that might sound like an oversimplification, but if you break it down into those three parts, it's a little bit easier to digest. Because building a sidecar is not necessarily the easiest thing in the world. There's a lot to it. I'm only going to be covering really a fraction of it in this video, just kind of highlights. So if you want to get it right, it's easier to break it down into those three sections. The frame I used was a Craigslist find. Here's a screenshot that luckily I still have of when I purchased this. Came out of Brooksville, I believe, Florida. And it was kind of out of a rough area, I got to be honest with you. Ichabod and I jumped in a pickup truck. I think I had my Tundra then. And we went up there and took a look at it. The guy wanted $500 for it. I gave him $300. And you can see in this ad, he says that it looks like he spelled it wrong, but a Ural frame. And clearly this was not a Ural sidecar frame. I could tell that right after I took a look at it. Anyway, I picked it up, gave him $300, threw it in the truck, and brought it home. Immediately took a look at it. The first thing I did was I pulled a wheel off, and the swing arm on this particular sidecar frame was absolutely a disaster. It was put together horribly. It was super loose. It had all sorts of axial and flexion. There was no way it was going to work. I don't have a whole lot of pictures on that, and that could actually be a video in itself. But at any rate, I took the tire off and that hub, which had a hub with a brake and brake parts inside of it. And the part numbers came back to Yamaha. And we're going to get back to the wheel here in a little bit, because I obviously have replaced that since. But the part numbers came back to either an early RD200, the two-stroke, or a little bit later, a few years later, the XS400, both street bikes. That would be a front wheel. So that's what that was off of, either a RD200 or an XS400, early 80s motorcycle is what somebody slapped on there. Here's what the frame looked like just laying on the garage floor after I brought it home, taking a look at it, doing an evaluation. So what I'm doing here is I've got it kind of tacked in place or just put in place with some jack stands. And I'm moving it around and I'm putting a level on it. I'm just trying to figure out whether or not this frame is actually going to work, because I have to calculate out where the wheel offset, the center of the sidecar wheel, is going to be relative to the motorcycle's rear wheel. And I have to calculate the angles, the distance of the sidecar frame away from the motorcycle. I have to make sure that it's going to be level when the motorcycle is essentially mostly vertical. I have to make sure it's square to the motorcycle. And I have to make sure that the sidecar frame is not angled or twisted or leaning in any particular way. So this is all the stuff you do when you're kind of putting something together that is from what appears to be like a junkyard and putting it together in a format where you can actually ride a sidecar on it. Here's an early shot of when I first got the thing cobbled together and hooked up to the bike. Luckily, this thing had the lowers and the uppers, but if I had to do it all over again, I'd do it differently, and I'll kind of explain that here in a minute, a little while, if I can remember to do that. But you can see right here that it's on three wheels, and I got it all hooked up. Now, I'm going to go into the mounts, but not in great detail, because I could do an entire video series on these mounts. There's a lot to them in some cases, but take a look at that sidecar wheel. You can clearly see that it's a front wheel from a Japanese motorcycle, in this case an early 80s Yamaha. This is the front lower. My rule when I did these mounts was no welding directly to the frame. And so this is bolted to existing bolt locations. And this is the way it's still to this day. And so this captures, again, the forward or lower front mount of the sidecar to the motorcycle. Here's the front upper. And what I did with this one, I had to make a clamping mechanism. I didn't want, again, weld to the frame. In retrospect, I probably should have, but it's never moved, so this is what I used. Now, that piece that you see that's got the split in it, you can kind of see it right there as I zoom up on it. It's a split piece that clamps on the frame member. I made that out of a piece of those, those stunt pegs that you can put on bicycles. A lot of the kids back in the 90s and 2000s so put them on like the front wheels of bicycles, and then they can like stunt on them and things like that. I don't know, one of my kids had on one of their bikes, and that bike was long gone, and I keep all that stuff around. So I cut and split and welded on that piece. It's a big, it's a good strong piece of steel, And again, that clamps around the main frame down tube. And that is, again, the front upper. That has never moved. That is solid as a rock there. Let's go back to the front lower again real quick. Here's another shot, but with the sidecar front lower side mounted to that. Now, sidecars of this type had these kind of clamshell type things that were clamping on a ball. So you'd have a ball on the bike side, and then this mechanism that would go inside that tube, that white part, and it was tapered. And when you tightened it from the back side, it would draw down and clamp on that ball, and those really suck. So when I welded in, as you can see, there's a weld right where the end is. So essentially, I capped off that end. You can see it's ground back, and it has a weld around the circumference of it. And then I put this pin in, which is like a farm implement pin. It's a pin with a big thread on it. It's like 3/4 or 7/8 thread. And of course, I drilled a hole in that cap and shoved it through, and a nut goes in with a lock washer on the inside of that white tube. That grabs that pin. I welded the two heavy tabs, or 1/4-inch tabs, on the plate that mounts to the bike, and then that gets bolted up with a grade 8 bolt. Now, I can't go into adjustment on this. I really wish I could, but I just wanted to mention that because if you're putting these together, the one thing you really have to think about is how do you adjust it? You need a couple of axes of adjustment. And again, I really can't explain it to you doing it this way. I'll try to shoot a little clip out on the actual sidecar and illustrate that for you if I can. But, when you build these mounts, you got to build some adjustability into them. You have to think about the direction that they're going to need to move to adjust in your toe in and out, and the level of the sidecar itself, and so forth. So I just kind of wanted to mention that. The rear lower started off like this, and there is a natural hole that goes through the frame. It's, I don't know what it was for, but it's just an opening. It's just a piece of the tube that they use to connect two pieces of the frame together, and it's just open from one side to the other. And what I ended up doing was I made a pipe that has a flange that goes in from the direction you see in it right here. In other words, it stops on that side of it, so it can go in and no further. Here's what that looks like before I shoved it in. And luckily, I just had a piece of pipe that fit nice and snug in there. And you see that part in the upper left, that's the flange side that goes in from the sidecar side and then bottoms on the edge of that tube in the frame. On the other side, I welded in a solid piece of steel and then drilled and tapped it with a large fender washer. It's a pretty thick washer. And what that does is it draws that in. I made that piece so it's just a little bit short of that piece in the frame that it goes through. That way it pulls it in and holds it up against that shoulder on the other side, on the sidecar side of the frame. This is the rear lower, pretty much finished at this point as far as the bike side. It's all painted up and everything. And what I ended up doing was I used the same kind of pin that you saw on the front one that goes through the white part there of the sidecar side. So I've already described that. But what it sticks into is the piece that you see that's got a little bend in it, some flats where the bolt goes through. That is a piece of fireplace, grate. Those fireplace things you put logs in, and it holds the logs up off the bottom of the fireplace. We replaced that, and I had that laying around. It was the right diameter, about a 1/2-inch diameter stuff, solid steel, and then bent that around, or I should say just cut it, and it was the right bend around that. Made the two pieces that thing is sandwiched between that pin. And then on the pipe that goes through the frame, like I showed you before, I just kind of ground in a half circle shape, like a radius, and then put that end of that into that and welded it in place. And that is not broken. I mean, when I first put it together, I said, this ain't going to last. And sure as hell it did. Now, again, I would do this differently if I was going to do it over again. And we'll discuss that here out on a bike, most likely. I'll do a little quick video on how I would do that. I'll explain myself. This is the beginnings of the rear upper. And as you can see, I just took a piece and bent it, and I welded a little, area or surface that was kind of proud of where that sits around the shock mount. This is the upper rear shock mount. So that is essentially pinched in there. What you can't see is on the bottom side of it, toward the tire, there's an L shape that wraps around under the frame to keep it from rotating. So really that rear upper is just pinched or sandwiched between the body of the shock when it's bolted in place and the frame. And again, that doesn't move either. That worked out really well. Just as a reminder, my rule was no welding on the frame, and that's what I was doing at that time, is trying to avoid any direct welding. You can see here, you get a really good idea what I was going for on this. And again, this is the current setup. I have not changed this. This works just fine, so, why bother with it? I have welded a gusset in there to kind of strengthen that up. I don't think I have a photo of that. That would be around where you can see that weld in the middle of the two pieces, just below the cap bolt that holds the shock in place. But that's the only thing I've ever done on that to keep it from flexing. So, again, this worked out really well, and I have not changed it very much at all. The base engineering of this is exactly the same as you see it in the picture.
Ichabod's going to go ahead and go over alignment and adjustability with you here. So take it away, Ichabod. Okay, I guess he's tired. I'll do it then. So there's three things you want to consider. There's a lot more than three, but I'm going to give you the three main ones you want to consider when you're setting up a sidecar. We'll get into adjustability here in a minute. The first one is the forward bias of your sidecar wheel relative to the motorcycle rear wheel. And you can see from this angle here, the sidecar wheel is forward of that rear wheel. So you take the center line of the rear wheel of the bike, the center line of your sidecar wheel, that line should be about 9 to 11 inches. All right, that's your forward bias of that. The next thing I'll discuss is toe in of the sidecar relative to the motorcycle. Now, you can discuss or debate why this is necessary, but I'll just kind of give you just a kind of an overview on it. And this is kind of my theory here. Now, when you're on a motorcycle with just two wheels, you have to counter steer and actually lean that motorcycle sometimes even to go straight. If you have some significant crown into a road, the surface features, a little crosswind, things like that, you could be actually going a little bit like this, going straight down the road to counteract that, okay, depending on the angle of the dangle of whatever you're dealing with. Well, when you have two things in a motorcycle that doesn't want to stay upright, it wants to lean back and forth, and this thing is exactly straight, that wheel is straight with that wheel, in other words, in perfect alignment. They're going to be fighting each other depending on what you're encountering as far as surface features and angles. So in one case, if the road angles this way, this thing's going to want to favor that way, and it's just going to be a mess going down the road. So what we do is we do a toe-in adjustment to kind of force the sidecar up into the bike and tighten that up. About a 1/2 inch to 5/8 of an inch is toe-in, and how I measure that is, there's a debate over this too, I'm sure, but I have a piece of extruded aluminum, that 2x2 square that you build lanais out of, and you always go off the rear wheel of the bike because your rear wheel and your front wheel are often dissimilar widths, okay? So I take that extruded aluminum with some bungees, and I actually put it about this high, so it's off the ground and only the rear wheel is influencing it, and of course it sticks up forward. Now I use that as a straight edge, and you go like, I don't really know what the standard is, but I go a couple of feet before the center line of the rear tire, and I measure it like probably about up where the fire extinguisher is. You measure out with a straight edge up against the wheel, and you get 1/2 inch to 5/8 toe in, and you kind of trial and error it, and you can figure it out. But if it works, it works. If it doesn't, you need to adjust it again. So again, I have about 5/8 up to there. Some guys will say run it all the way up to the front and then make the measurement over to your straight edge, but I think it's about a foot or two in front of the rear wheel is really what you want to do. That's what I've read, and that's what I do. All right, so that's the second thing. The third thing is lean out. When you're going down the road, of course, this is a right-sided sidecar. This is for the U.S. only, or other countries where people drive on the correct side of the road. You want to have a little bit of lean out on a motorcycle, because what you're doing is, again, the bike does not want to necessarily stay upright, especially with round motorcycle tires on it. You have a mass hanging off the right side of the bike here, and to counteract that mass, what you do is you take advantage of the fact that this bike, when it has motorcycle tires on it in particular, when it leans over, okay, it wants to fall in that direction. That's how we can turn so sharp. When you counter steer, you are throwing the bike into a lean, throwing it into a lean by steering in the opposite direction. So if you have this perpetually slightly out and sort of like leaning in that angle, like you're going to turning, it's going to be naturally wanting to force, counteract the forces of this mass off the right side of the bike. So generally you do about between half and 1.5 degrees of lean out. I think this is set about 1.2, 1.3, I don't know. And I use a digital, digital level, and just make sure it's on the most level part of the floor. And you can adjust it by feel too, but that's generally what you do. So those are the three things: the offset, the toe in of the sidecar wheel, and the lean out of the bike. Talk briefly about adjustability here. I mentioned that before. I think I did at least. When you set one of these things up, you got to be thinking in your head, how am I going to adjust it? How am I going to adjust the height? Like if you had a fixed front, how do you raise the back up and down? Something like that. And you got to be able to dial this thing in, or maybe make some adjustments in the future. Now, when you're doing that, you say to yourself, what are my planes? What are my angles? I want to make sure that the sidecar frame is level this way. I want to make sure that it's level that way. And I want to make sure that is when the sidecars and the wheel and so forth is sitting in there, that it's basically in a vertical. This line is vertical and not cocked over one way or the other. How we do that is through adjustability. We raise or lower. You can raise or lower the wheel of the sidecar if that's possible. So what that'll do is it'll change the attitude this way. If that's not a part of your sidecar, or ability of your sidecar, that is, you have to lower the front or raise the front. You're going to have to adjust it solely from this side. So as you build the thing, you got to build that into it. You have to decide where you're going to put the articulation points to make that movement. As far as the lean out of the bike, this is solely done by your uprights that go from the frame to the highest point of the bike where you have these things hooked up. The only thing you have to consider on that, though, is if you're moving these, to move the bike out, or move it in, like lean it out, you have to have some articulation this way down there at the lowers. And there's just enough little bit of space on mine where they can do that. That's where those little ball thing I was talking about before, that's why they use them, because it's a 360 degree essentially, well, not quite 360, but it's a probably 270 degrees of adjustability in all directions with a ball like that. So it's actually pretty good, but in my cases, I just didn't like them. So this has a certain amount of adjustability in that angle this way. So if I do cock it, make this longer, pushing the bike out a little bit more, then that will move a little bit, to react to that, because of course that's fixed over to here. Same with the front. So you have to consider that stuff when you're designing these things as far as adjustability goes. Now the last thing I'll mention about that is, when you're setting up for design, not necessarily an adjustability, but more of a setup thing, I want you to keep a triangle in mind, because a triangle is about the strongest shape that you can do when you're doing like an engineering thing, to make sure you have a good strength. Now you can see my triangle is right here. You have the rear upper that goes down, and then you have the front upper that goes down. This one angles in that direction. This one angles in that direction. So you have kind of a triangle. So what does that mean? When the bike brakes hard and the sidecar wants to keep going, this one, because it's angled in that way, prevents that from happening. And likewise, or vice versa rather, when you're under acceleration. So that's why I triangulated these things, because you get much better strength that way. So if you have them straight out, if both of these are exactly parallel, you're not going to have that kind of stability longitudinally when you're comparing it to the motorcycle with those kind of forces, decel or XL. So that's just a couple of points as far as adjustability and layout as far as the angles and so forth, how you have to set it up.
Here's a shot of the sidecar swing arm. I can't go into it very deeply because it was a pretty in-depth procedure and we don't have the time. But this particular shot with the original axle, what that is a bolt hole. It goes through from the inside. I rebushed it all out originally, made it a lot tighter, and added some grease fittings, as you can see. And then there's a bolt with essentially a fender or flange washer on the outside of that. That's just long enough as far as the axle goes for it to pinch up on the axle, not necessarily on the sidecar frame and pinch the swing arm in place. There's a certain amount of those forces in there, but the way I designed it, it bottoms out on the axle. We'll have to discuss that in another video, maybe when we do the leading link front end, because it's kind of related. Leading link is a swing arm in itself. But since then, all I can tell you is that I have machined a new pivot for that, did some better work on the bushings and tightened it up even more. So that's about all we can get into in this video on the sidecar swing arm. My sidecar tub or chair, we'll just call it the body, was obtained from eBay. It was $1,200 when I bought it, and that was like 6-7 years ago. So just imagine what one would cost now. It's all metal. It was custom fabricated. It needed a lot of finishing work, but it was shipped to me via, that lift ramp truck, whatever they're called, and the shipping wasn't too bad on it as well. So that's what it looked like from the eBay ad right there. Before I mounted the sidecar body to the frame, I had to figure out a way to change around to a flat because I wasn't going to go directly down onto the sidecar frame. Plus, I needed a little bit of elevation for other features of the tubular frame shape. So what I did was I built these bunks. I call them bunks. They're just like bunks on a boat trailer that the boat slides up on, sort of. But these are made out of angle iron. There's 2 pieces of angle iron that are overlapping each other, and they come down at slightly different angles or of the radius of the round tubing. I made a little drawing of it here so you can kind of understand where I was going with this. And there's, of course, a picture here on the screen, and I'll zoom up on here shortly. You can see them a little bit better. Now, what these do, again, is give me a flat spot. And it was really easy just flattening them out. I just put a straight edge across them until they were both parallel as far as the top surface. And I stitch weld them in, and there's plenty of room inside the ends where I can reach in after I drilled a hole to get a bolt to come up through from the bottom. I think I tack welded those in by reaching in with the nozzle, and then you just drop the sidecar tub down on top of it with the appropriately located holes. And again, it's mounted on rubber, pretty thick rubber, about a 1/4 inch rubber. Here's a couple of shots of the unfinished sidecar body on the frame, bolted in place while I was doing other alignment and fabrication work. You can see that there is no fender on there. We'll get to that shortly, and I promise it'll be quick. Fender's made out of a trailer fender. I went over to a trailer place and got the right size one, but it was too wide, so I ripped it in half, tacked it, liked what I saw, and then I just finish welded it, and then eventually got finished in final body work. Here's part of that process when I had it up on the bench and I was doing the welding. I cut a backing plate out of some steel that I purchased at the store. It was just large enough to do it. And so that's what forms the back part. And that's where the mounts are, where it mounts to the actual sidecar frame. So here we are in semi-finished mock-up. You can see the fenders in place. Then everything came apart and I painted the frame gloss black and primed the fender. Here's a shot of me doing a feeble attempt at painting with an air gun, but I got it done. Painted the inside and out and also the fender. And here we're all clear coated, it's just curing up. Luckily the weather was really great at that particular time of the year, so I had low humidity and it really took off really well as far as the paint goes. In this pic you can see the original wheel is still on there. The operation I was doing at that time was I was replacing this wheel with the mag that's on there right now. The mag I obtained from eBay, and it came from, I think, an 83 or an 84 KZ 550 LTD shaft drive bike. And so I was able to utilize the drum brake part of that, as you can see I did with the drum brake on this old, spoked Yamaha wheel as well. And so, talk really quick about the fairing. That's a Rooster period correct fairing. That's it in the original condition. This is the original one that I got, not the replacement. So I've stripped all the paint, got it masked off and primed it, and I'm ready for final paint on this. And here I've got a couple of coats of paint on it, then a clear, and then I put some pinstripes under the clear, as you can see those gold pinstripes. The replacement has the exact same look to it. I did it exactly the same. Here's a shot of the original cockpit. That pocket above the instruments, the Speedo and Attack, has had for a long time and still does an aftermarket stereo, and I do have XM satellite radio hooked up to it, so yeah, I'm a bit spoiled when it comes to that. But I would be remiss without showing you some pictures of what it looked like before the Rooster was put on there, but it was attached to the sidecar. Go the other way now. Hey, Nina.
Alright guys, that's about it. I'm going to wrap this video up. I know there's a lot of information in here. A little bit longer than I wanted to make it, but there's a lot going on with this sidecar. A lot more than I can even show in one single video. I really have thousands of hours into this video, into this sidecar, and I couldn't even begin to scratch the surface on some of the things that I needed to do. What I wanted to mention was, as far as if I was to do it over again, what I would do differently, I would build a subframe for the lowers. And I'm not going to explain that in this video. We can go into it in another video and I'll give you some examples, or just go look it up. Use the Google machine and look up, sidecar, and sidecar subframes, and you'll see what I'm talking about. That's the best way really to do the bottom or the lowers on a sidecar as far as those mounts go. But it is what it is, and it works, so I'm not going to redo it. Now, if you want me to, I will do a video on the leading link front end. I made that all by hand. I had 0 machine tools at that time except a tiny drill press. And basically, if you want to see it, you need to let me know. So if this video does poorly as far as its performance, I'll know not to do that. Or if you don't put any comments saying, hey, yeah, go ahead and give us some more detail. Or if you want detail on one specific or 2 specific things, for me to go deeper into it, let's say you're building a sidecar and you want to see what I did on a certain part of it, like the sidecar swing arm or the sidecar pivot, the wheel pivot, the axle, whatever you want to call it, I can do that. But you got to let me know, otherwise I'm not going to waste my time or yours. So I think we'll finish it up. Don't just repair, restore. Thanks for watching. Catch you on next video. We'll go ahead and wrap this one up with some more shots of the dog in the sidecar. So Ichabod, take it away. Stage left.